Ethan Cole was a worn-out, long-haul truck driver fighting through a violent snowstorm in the mountains of Montana to meet an impossible delivery deadline. On a deserted highway, he stopped to help a stranded family whose SUV had broken down in the freezing cold, a choice that violated company policy and cost him his pay and nearly his career. 2 weeks later, Ethan was summoned to the corporate headquarters of Silver Peak Transport in Seattle, convinced he was about to be fired for good. But the moment he stepped into the executive office, he froze in shock. Sitting beside the CEO was the same man he had rescued from the storm, and he had just become the new owner of the entire company. The snow came down so hard, it looked like the entire sky had collapsed onto the highway. Ethan Cole tightened both hands around the steering wheel of his 18-wheeler as icy wind slammed against the side of the trailer hard enough to make the whole rig shudder. The narrow Montana highway stretched endlessly ahead of him, buried under layers of fresh snow and glowing faintly beneath the weak yellow reflection of his headlights. It was nearly 2 in the morning. Most sane people were asleep in warm homes by now. But long-haul truckers lived in a different world. A world of deadlines, black coffee, frozen rest stops, and lonely highways that never seemed to end. Ethan rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the digital clock glowing on the dashboard. 1:52 a.m., still over 300 miles from Denver. His phone buzzed loudly through the cab speakers, and he already knew who it was before checking the screen. Victor Hayes. Ethan sighed before answering through Bluetooth. Yeah. Victor's voice exploded through the truck immediately. Don't yeah me, Cole. You better not be slowing down because of a little snow. Ethan clenched his jaw. Roads are icing over. State Patrol already has warnings out. I don't care if God himself is throwing snowballs at your windshield, Victor snapped. That medical shipment needs to be in Denver by 7 sharp. The hospital contract is worth millions. Ethan stared through the storm in silence. Victor continued, his tone sharp and cruel. You're already on thin ice with this company. 1 late delivery, and I'll replace you before sunrise. Understood? The line went dead. Ethan tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and exhaled slowly. Victor Hayes had managed the Denver depot for 6 years, and every driver under him hated him. The man ruled through fear, threats, and impossible schedules. Drivers were numbers to him. Replaceable equipment with heartbeats. Outside, the storm worsened. Snow whipped across the windshield so violently that Ethan could barely see the reflective lane markers anymore. He slowed slightly, ignoring the nervous knot tightening in his stomach. The trailer behind him carried critical medical equipment bound for a Denver hospital expansion project. Missing the delivery window would trigger massive penalties for Silver Peak Transport, and Victor would make sure Ethan paid for every dollar of it. A tired ache spread through Ethan's shoulders. At 42 years old, he had spent over half his life on the road. Endless miles, endless deliveries, endless nights eating vending machine dinners beneath fluorescent truck stop lights. His wife, Laura, barely slept when he was driving through storms. His 12-year-old son Mason had started asking why Dad always missed birthdays and school games. The truth was simple. Bills didn't care about birthdays. The heater rattled weakly as freezing air slipped through the edges of the cab doors. Ethan reached for his coffee cup, only to discover it had gone cold an hour ago. Then he saw it, a faint blinking light ahead. Hazard lights, barely visible through the blizzard. Ethan narrowed his eyes. A dark SUV sat crooked on the shoulder near a snowbank, half buried already. One weak headlight flickered uselessly through the storm. As Ethan's truck passed closer, his headlights swept across the frozen windows, and for a brief second, He saw movement inside, a woman and a child in the back seat. Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel as his truck continued forward into the storm. Ethan stared into the blizzard through his side mirror as the SUV slowly disappeared behind him. Keep driving. That was the smart choice. That was the company choice. Victor Hayes' voice still echoed inside his head like a threat carved into steel. One late delivery, and I'll replace you before sunrise. Ethan gripped the wheel tighter and pressed harder on the accelerator, trying to force himself forward. The truck's engine growled beneath him, while snow battered the windshield in violent waves. But then another image forced its way into his mind. The child in the back seat, small, still, wrapped in a blanket. Out here, temperatures were already dropping below zero. If the SUV lost heat completely, that family could freeze to death long before sunrise. Ethan cursed under his breath. Damn it! He flipped on his turn signal, slowed the rig carefully on the icy highway, and maneuvered the massive truck onto the shoulder nearly 100 yards ahead of the stranded SUV. The tires crunched loudly through packed snow as the 18-wheeler came to a stop. For a moment, Ethan simply sat there, staring ahead. He already knew this decision could cost him everything. Then he grabbed his heavy winter coat and climbed down into the storm. The wind hit him like a punch. Snow whipped across his face so hard it stung his skin instantly. His boots sank deep into the snow as he fought his way back toward the SUV through the freezing darkness. The driver's door suddenly opened. A tall man in his late 50s stepped out, struggling against the wind. Snow covered his expensive dark coat, and exhaustion lined his face. "Thank God!" the man shouted over the storm. "I didn't think anyone was going to stop." Ethan reached them and immediately glanced inside the vehicle. A woman sat in the passenger seat, clutching a little girl beneath layers of blankets. The child looked pale and frightened. "How long have you been stuck?" Ethan asked. "Almost an hour," the man answered. "The engine just died. No warning. No signal either." He held up a useless cell phone. "We've got nothing." Ethan nodded grimly. "What's your name?" "Charles Whitmore." "Ethan Cole." Charles looked toward the truck parked ahead. "You driving through this mess alone?" "Been doing it 20 years." Ethan moved toward the SUV's hood and forced it open against the wind. Snow immediately coated the engine compartment. He checked quickly with a flashlight, though he already suspected the truth. Modern SUVs were nightmares in extreme weather when electronics failed. After several minutes, Ethan shut the hood again. "It's bad," he admitted. "Electrical systems probably shot. Battery may have frozen too." Charles ran a tired hand through his snow-covered hair. "Can you call a tow?" "No signal out here." Ethan looked down the endless white highway. "And honestly, in weather like this, nobody's getting here until morning." The little girl inside the SUV began coughing. Margaret Whitmore pulled her daughter closer, trying to keep her warm. Ethan felt something twist hard inside his chest. He thought about Laura, about Mason, about what he would pray for if his own family were stranded out here tonight. Charles noticed the conflict on Ethan's face immediately. "You've got somewhere to be," he said quietly. "I can tell." Ethan gave a humorless laugh. "Big delivery, big deadline, bigger boss." "Then you should probably keep moving." Maybe he should have. Maybe a smarter man would have. Ethan looked at the frightened child one more time. Then he made the decision that would change his life forever. "There's a roadside lodge about 20 miles west of here," he said. "I can tow you there." Charles blinked in shock. "You'd do that?" Ethan nodded slowly. "It'll make me late," he admitted. Probably very late. The storm howled around them. Charles stared at him for a long moment before speaking again. "Why would you risk that for strangers?" Ethan looked toward the little girl inside the SUV. "Because leaving you here would bother me a whole lot longer than losing a job." The heavy tow chains groaned under the strain as Ethan carefully tightened the final hook beneath the rear frame of the SUV. Snow blasted across the highway in thick white sheets, while the freezing wind howled around the vehicles like a living thing. Ethan's gloves were soaked through completely now, and he could barely feel his fingers anymore. Charles Whitmore stepped beside him, holding a flashlight steady through the storm. "You do this often?" Charles asked. Ethan gave a short laugh. "Towing stranded billionaires in the middle of nowhere? Not usually." Charles smiled faintly at that. There was something unusual about the man. Even freezing in a blizzard at 2 in the morning, he carried himself with a calm confidence Ethan couldn't quite place. Not arrogant, controlled. Like someone used to pressure. Ethan climbed back into his truck and grabbed the CB radio microphone. "You copy me?" he asked. A moment of static answered him before Charles's voice came through weakly from the SUV. "Loud and clear. Stay directly behind me. Don't brake hard unless I tell you." "Understood." Ethan eased the massive truck forward slowly. The chains tightened with a violent jerk before the SUV finally began moving through the snow behind the trailer. 20 miles. Under normal conditions, it would have taken 25 minutes. Tonight it felt like crossing the Arctic. The mountain roads west of Billings had become almost invisible beneath the storm. Several times Ethan felt the trailer drift dangerously on black ice before correcting carefully. One mistake out here could send both vehicles sliding into a ravine. Inside the cab, exhaustion settled deeper into his bones. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m. Every passing minute tightened the noose around his career. The CB radio crackled suddenly. "How long have you been driving trucks?" Charles asked. "Since I was 21. That's a long time. Feels longer." Charles was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "You married?" "Yeah. Wife named Laura. One son." "You must miss them." Ethan stared through the windshield at the endless storm. "Road doesn't leave much room for family." "I understand that better than you might think," Charles said softly. Something about the way he said it caught Ethan's attention. Most wealthy men Ethan had encountered during deliveries talked differently. Colder, detached. But Charles sounded tired, human. The CB crackled again. "You stopped tonight, even though it could hurt you," Charles said. Most people wouldn't. Ethan shrugged, even though Charles couldn't see him. "Most people probably got more sense than me." "I doubt that." The conversation faded after that. For the next hour, the only sounds were engine noise, radio static, and the relentless fury of the storm surrounding them. Then finally, through the blowing snow, Ethan spotted warm yellow lights glowing ahead. Pine Ridge Lodge. Relief flooded through him. The small roadside motel sat near the highway exit, like a lonely island of safety buried in the mountains. Ethan carefully pulled the truck into the parking lot, while the SUV rolled slowly behind him. As soon as they stopped, Margaret climbed out carrying Emily wrapped tightly in blankets and hurried toward the lobby entrance. Charles approached Ethan's driver's side window while snow continued falling around them. "You saved my family tonight," he said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "Just got lucky finding you." Charles reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick leather wallet. "At least let me compensate you for the delay." He held out several $100 bills. Ethan immediately pushed the hand away. "No, sir." Charles frowned. "You're losing time and money because of us." "Maybe." Ethan glanced toward the motel lobby where Emily disappeared safely inside. "Still doesn't feel right taking it." For the first time all night, Charles truly studied him, not casually, carefully, as if trying to understand something deeper. Then slowly, Charles lowered the money. "There aren't many men left like you, Ethan Cole." Ethan looked at the dashboard clock again. 4:11 a.m. His stomach dropped instantly. Denver was still over 200 miles away, and his delivery deadline was less than 3 hours away. Charles followed his gaze to the clock. "You're going to be very late, aren't you?" Ethan leaned back heavily in the driver's seat. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "Very late." The storm finally loosened its grip just after sunrise. By then, Ethan had been awake for nearly 22 straight hours. His eyes burned from exhaustion as the massive Silver Peak truck rolled down the final stretch of interstate toward Denver. Dirty snow lined the highway barriers, while pale winter sunlight pushed weakly through heavy gray clouds overhead. The dashboard clock read 10:18 a.m., 3 hours and 18 minutes late. Every mile closer to the Denver depot made Ethan's stomach tighten harder. He already knew exactly how this would go. Victor Hayes didn't tolerate mistakes, and he especially didn't tolerate drivers making decisions for themselves. The Denver Silver Peak Depot finally appeared ahead, a sprawling industrial yard filled with trailers, diesel smoke, forklifts, and rows of exhausted drivers beginning their morning routes. The moment Ethan parked at Dock 14, he noticed people staring. Word traveled fast in trucking depots, especially bad news. A mechanic named Ray stepped beside the cab while Ethan climbed down slowly from the truck. "You okay?" Ray asked quietly. Ethan shrugged tiredly. "Ask me in 24 hours. Ray looked uncomfortable. "Victor's been losing his mind all morning." "Yeah," Ethan muttered. "I figured." Before Ethan could grab his bag, his phone buzzed violently in his pocket. One text message. "Victor Hayes. My office. Now." No greeting. No explanation, just judgment waiting behind a closed door. Ethan walked through the depot slowly, while conversations around him lowered into whispers. Drivers avoided eye contact. Dispatchers suddenly became very busy staring at computer screens. Nobody wanted to be associated with a dead man walking. Victor's office overlooked the loading floor through large glass windows. The blinds were half open, revealing Victor pacing furiously inside, like a predator trapped in a cage. Ethan knocked once before entering. Victor immediately slammed a thick stack of paperwork onto the desk. "Do you have any idea," he exploded, "what you've done?" Ethan stayed calm. "I know I'm late." "Late?" Victor barked. "You're over 3 hours late carrying priority medical cargo during a contract week." Spit practically flew from his mouth. That shipment delay triggered penalty clauses worth nearly $30,000. Several employees outside the office glanced nervously through the glass walls. Victor didn't care. Humiliating people publicly was one of his favorite management techniques. Ethan stood silently while Victor continued raging. "You think this is some kind of charity company?" Victor shouted. "You think I pay drivers to wander around Montana rescuing every idiot tourist that gets stuck in snow?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "There was a little girl in that SUV." Victor laughed coldly. "And?" The single word hung in the office like poison. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. Victor leaned forward aggressively over the desk. "You had one responsibility," he snapped. "Deliver the cargo on time. That's it. Not heroics, not emotional decisions. Cargo." "There was no cell service," Ethan replied evenly. "Temperatures were below 0. They could have died out there." Victor rolled his eyes dramatically. "And somehow that became your problem?" For a brief moment, Ethan imagined grabbing the man by his expensive tie and dragging him across the desk. Instead, he took a slow breath. "I made the call I could live with." Victor's face darkened instantly. "Oh, I'm sure that line sounded real noble in your head." He yanked open a desk drawer, pulled out several forms, and scribbled signatures furiously across them. Then he shoved the papers toward Ethan. "Congratulations," Victor said with a cruel smile. "1 week suspension without pay. Ethan looked down at the paperwork silently. Final written warning. One more violation and termination would be immediate. You're lucky I'm not firing you today, Victor continued. Frankly, you're not worth the paperwork. The office fell silent. Outside the glass walls, employees quickly looked away. Ethan slowly picked up the disciplinary forms. A week without pay. Laura would panic when she heard. Bills were already behind. Christmas was 6 weeks away. Victor leaned back smugly in his chair. Maybe next time, he said softly, you'll remember who signs your paycheck. Ethan stared at him for a long moment. Then he folded the papers carefully and tucked them into his jacket pocket. No, Ethan said quietly. Victor frowned. What? Ethan looked him directly in the eye. Next time, he said calmly, I'd stop again. The suspension turned Ethan's small house painfully quiet. For the first 2 days, he barely left the living room. Winter clouds hung low over Denver, while cold wind rattled the loose gutters outside. The disciplinary papers Victor Hayes had given him sat folded on the kitchen table like a death sentence waiting to happen. Laura tried not to show how worried she was, but Ethan noticed everything. The way she stared too long at grocery receipts. The way she quietly lowered the thermostat at night. The way she avoided mentioning Christmas shopping for Mason. One missed paycheck hurt. 2 could destroy them. You did the right thing, Laura said one evening while washing dishes. Ethan sat silently at the table, staring into a cup of untouched coffee. Maybe, he answered quietly. Doesn't mean it was smart. Laura dried her hands and walked over beside him. You saved a family and might have destroyed my own. She touched his shoulder gently. No, Victor Hayes did that. Ethan wanted to believe her, but trucking jobs with disciplinary marks were difficult to replace. Every company asked questions. Every application led back to Silver Peak. And Victor knew it. By Thursday afternoon, Ethan had applied to 7 different logistics companies across Colorado. Only one responded. Politely. With rejection. That night he sat alone in the garage, pretending to organize tools while actually trying to hide his frustration from Laura and Mason. Then his phone buzzed. New email notification. Silver Peak Corporate Headquarters. Ethan's stomach immediately tightened. He opened it. Slowly, his eyes moved across the screen twice before the words fully registered. Mr. Ethan Cole and Mr. Victor Hayes are hereby required to report to corporate headquarters in Seattle, Washington on Monday at 9 a.m. for formal executive review regarding Incident Report 7A-441. Failure to appear may result in immediate termination. Ethan stared at the message in disbelief. Corporate review. Seattle headquarters. This wasn't normal. Depot managers handled disciplinary issues internally all the time. Drivers didn't get summoned across the country unless something serious was happening. Very serious. Laura read the fear on his face immediately. What is it? Ethan handed her the phone silently. Her expression fell as she read the email. Oh God. Yeah. You think they're firing you? Ethan leaned back heavily in the chair. No, he muttered darkly. I think they're making an example out of me. The next morning, he arrived at the depot to collect paperwork for the trip. The atmosphere inside felt strange. Quiet. People looked at him carefully, sympathetically, like someone attending his own funeral. Victor Hayes emerged from his office wearing an expensive gray coat and carrying a leather briefcase. The smug satisfaction on his face made Ethan instantly angry. Well, Victor said casually, looks like corporate finally noticed your little stunt. Ethan said nothing. Victor stepped closer and lowered his voice. Friendly advice? Don't argue during the meeting. I wasn't planning to. Victor smirked. Good. Because once executives get involved, careers disappear fast. He adjusted his coat sleeve calmly. Honestly, you should probably start looking outside the trucking industry. Ethan clenched his jaw, but stayed silent. Victor loved this. The fear, the control, the humiliation. You know what your problem is, Ethan, Victor continued. You think emotions belong in business. He pointed toward the depot floor. That company survives because people follow schedules, rules, systems. His smile hardened. Not because truck drivers decide they're superheroes. Ethan stared at him coldly. Then he picked up his travel envelope from dispatch and turned away without another word. 3 days later, Ethan boarded a long-distance bus heading northwest toward Seattle. Snow-covered mountains rolled past outside the windows, while exhaustion settled deep into his chest. 21 years driving trucks, thousands of successful deliveries, endless nights away from home, and somehow it all seemed ready to end because he stopped to help freezing strangers on the side of the road. As darkness fell outside the bus window, Ethan closed his eyes heavily. For the first time in years, he truly had no idea what waited for him at the end of the road. Seattle felt like another planet. Ethan stepped off the bus just after sunrise, exhausted and stiff from the 2-day ride across the country. Rain fell lightly over the city streets, while glass skyscrapers disappeared into low gray clouds above. Everything about downtown Seattle felt polished, expensive, and far removed from the diesel-stained trucking depots Ethan had spent his life in. By the time he reached Rainier Financial Tower, his nerves were stretched tight enough to snap. The massive building rose above downtown like a monument to corporate power. Men in tailored suits hurried through revolving doors carrying briefcases that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly mortgage payment. He suddenly became very aware of his worn winter coat. The security guard in the marble lobby checked Ethan's ID before directing him toward the executive elevators. Top floor, corporate executive suite. Ethan swallowed hard. This was really happening. When the elevator doors finally opened, thick carpet muffled every sound beneath his boots. The executive floor looked more like a luxury hotel than a transportation company headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Seattle skyline. Paintings lined the walls. Everything smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee. And standing near the reception desk was Victor Hayes. Victor adjusted his tie when he saw Ethan approaching. Unlike Ethan, he looked perfectly comfortable here, smug even. Well, Victor said casually, you clean up better than I expected. Ethan ignored him. Victor stepped closer, with fake sympathy written across his face. Look, he said quietly, when we go in there, keep your mouth shut and let me handle this. Ethan frowned. Handle what? Victor sighed dramatically. Damage control. He straightened his suit jacket. I've already explained to corporate that you're a decent driver who made an emotional mistake. He lowered his voice further. If we're lucky, maybe they'll let you resign quietly instead of terminating you outright. Ethan stared at him. Even now, Victor still needed control, still needed to feel superior. Before Ethan could respond, the receptionist stood politely. Mr. Hayes, Mr. Cole, they're ready for you now. Large wooden doors opened slowly at the end of the hallway. Ethan followed Victor inside. The executive office was enormous. One entire wall overlooked Seattle beneath sheets of rain. A long conference table stretched across the room, beside shelves filled with awards, photographs, and framed business articles. At the far end sat Silver Peak's CEO, Richard Lawson, silver-haired and intimidating behind a polished black desk. But Ethan barely noticed him because someone else sat nearby. A familiar face. Ethan froze instantly. Charles Whitmore. For a second, Ethan genuinely wondered if exhaustion was making him hallucinate. The same man from the Montana snowstorm sat calmly in a dark tailored suit beside the CEO's desk. gone with a snow-covered coat and desperate expression from that night on the highway. Now Charles looked powerful, composed, completely at home in this world. Victor glanced at Charles briefly with mild annoyance before focusing on the CEO. "Mr. Lawson," Victor began quickly, "before we start, I'd just like to say I've already taken corrective disciplinary action regarding—" "Sit down, Victor," the CEO interrupted coldly. Victor immediately obeyed. Ethan remained standing, unable to take his eyes off Charles. Then Charles looked directly at him and smiled. Small, knowing, almost amused. That same calm expression from the storm returned to his face. "Good to see you again, Ethan." Victor's head turned sharply toward Charles. His confusion was immediate. "You two know each other?" Victor asked slowly. The room became very quiet. Richard Lawson folded his hands together carefully before speaking. "Mr. Hayes," he said evenly, "there's an important development you haven't yet been informed about." Victor blinked. Lawson gestured respectfully toward Charles. "As of last month, Evercrest Holdings completed acquisition of controlling shares in Silver Peak Transport." Victor frowned uncertainly. Lawson continued, "Which means, effective immediately," he paused deliberately, "Mr. Charles Whitmore is now the majority owner and acting chairman of this company." Silence. Absolute silence. Victor's face lost all color. Ethan watched the realization spread slowly through the man's expression, like a building collapse happening in slow motion. The stranded motorist from Montana, the man Ethan had rescued, the man Victor had mocked him for helping, was now his boss. Charles folded his hands calmly, while Victor stared at him in horror. Then Charles spoke softly. "And I believe," he said, never taking his eyes off Victor, "we have a great deal to discuss." Victor Hayes looked like a man standing on collapsing ice. His hands gripped the arms of the conference chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Sweat glistened along his forehead despite the cool temperature inside the executive office. Ethan had never seen him afraid before, not once. At the Denver depot, Victor had always been the loudest voice in every room. The man controlled drivers through intimidation, threats, and fear. He enjoyed making people nervous, but now the fear belonged entirely to him. Charles Whitmore sat calmly beside the executive desk, studying Victor with quiet disappointment. Not rage, not revenge, disappointment. And somehow, that looked far worse. Victor finally forced out a weak laugh. "There's clearly been some misunderstanding here," he stammered. "I had no idea Mr. Whitmore was—" "The owner of the company?" Charles finished calmly. Victor swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Charles leaned back slightly in his chair. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "the interesting thing about that night in Montana wasn't the storm." Nobody spoke. Charles continued quietly. "It wasn't the snow, or the danger, or even the fact that my daughter was trapped in a freezing vehicle." His eyes shifted toward Ethan. "It was the fact that one exhausted truck driver showed more humanity in 10 minutes than an entire corporate management system showed in 2 weeks afterward." Victor's face tightened. "Sir, with all due respect, company policy regarding unauthorized delays." Charles raised one hand. Victor stopped speaking instantly. "I spent the last 14 days reviewing Silver Peak's internal culture," Charles said. "Employee reports, safety records, exit interviews, anonymous complaints." Every word seemed to make Victor shrink further into his chair. "And your name appeared constantly." Ethan watched the color drain slowly from Victor's face again. Charles stood and walked toward the massive rain-covered windows overlooking Seattle. "Do you know what I discovered, Mr. Hayes?" he asked softly. Victor remained silent. "I discovered a regional manager who created a culture of fear." Charles turned back slowly. Drivers terrified to report exhaustion, Mechanics pressured to rush inspections. Dispatchers threatened over impossible schedules. Victor immediately shook his head. "That's not fair." "And worst of all," Charles interrupted sharply, "I discovered a manager who punished a man for saving a freezing child during a deadly storm." The room fell silent again. Heavy rain tapped softly against the windows behind them. Victor looked toward Ethan desperately. For the first time ever, Ethan saw genuine panic in the man's eyes. "Ethan," Victor said quickly, "listen, maybe we both handled things emotionally that day." "No," Charles said coldly. "Only one man acted emotionally that day." He stepped closer to Victor, and it wasn't Ethan. Victor's breathing became shallow. Charles's voice lowered. "You mocked compassion because you viewed human beings as delivery equipment." His eyes hardened. "That is not leadership. That is moral failure." Victor opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. Charles glanced briefly toward Richard Lawson. The former CEO gave a small, silent nod. Decision made. Charles looked directly at Victor. "Effective immediately," he said firmly. "Your employment with Silver Peak Transport is terminated." Victor froze completely. "You'll return to Denver today," Charles continued. "Collect your personal belongings under supervision and surrender all company credentials before midnight." "Sir, please." "I'm not finished." Charles's tone turned sharp enough to cut steel. "You threatened good employees because it made you feel powerful." He stepped closer. "You created an environment where profit mattered more than people." Victor's shoulders collapsed. "And that ends today." The office doors opened quietly behind them. 2 security officers entered. Victor stared around the room helplessly, like a man waking from a nightmare too late to stop it. Then slowly, painfully, his eyes turned toward Ethan. The humiliation in them was unbearable, but Ethan felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion. Victor stood shakily while security waited beside the door. Before leaving, he looked once more at Charles. "You're making a mistake," he muttered weakly. Charles answered without hesitation. "No, Victor." His voice remained calm. "Hiring you was the mistake." The doors closed behind Victor moments later. Silence filled the office. Then Charles turned toward Ethan. The hardness in his expression disappeared instantly. "You saved my family," he said quietly. Ethan shook his head slightly. "I just stopped to help." Charles smiled faintly. "That's exactly why this company needs men like you." The silence inside the executive office felt surreal after Victor Hayes was escorted out. Rain continued falling against the towering windows overlooking Seattle, while Ethan stood motionless near the conference table, still trying to process everything that had just happened. 2 weeks ago, he had been a suspended truck driver, wondering how to pay his mortgage. Now the most feared manager in the Denver depot had just been fired in front of him by the man he rescued during a snowstorm. Nothing about this felt real. Charles Whitmore returned calmly to his chair, while Richard Lawson quietly gathered paperwork at the far end of the office. Then Charles looked directly at Ethan. "I have a problem," he said casually. Ethan blinked. "Sir?" Charles folded his hands together thoughtfully. "My Denver Regional Depot suddenly has no manager." Ethan frowned slightly, unsure where this conversation was going. Charles continued, "And unfortunately, replacing leadership is much harder than replacing equipment." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not really sure what that has to do with me." Charles studied him for a moment. "Actually," he said softly, "it has everything to do with you." Ethan stared at him in confusion. Charles leaned forward slightly. "Ethan, over the last several days, I've spoken with drivers, dispatchers, mechanics, and supervisors from the Denver operation." He paused. "Do you know what every single one of them said about you?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "They said you were the man people trusted, The words landed harder than Ethan expected. Charles continued. They said you trained younger drivers without being asked, that you stayed late helping mechanics, that you covered routes for sick co-workers. His eyes sharpened slightly. And they said you were the only driver who regularly stood up to Victor Hayes. Ethan gave a tired laugh that usually ended badly. Yes, Charles agreed, because bad leaders fear good men. Richard Lawson quietly excused himself from the office, leaving the two men alone. Charles stood and walked slowly toward the rain-covered windows. When I bought Silver Peak, he said, I didn't buy trucks. I didn't buy warehouses. He looked back at Ethan. I bought people. Ethan listened carefully. And right now, Charles continued, those people don't trust leadership anymore. The room fell quiet again. Then Charles spoke the sentence Ethan never could have imagined hearing. I want you to run the Denver Regional Depot. Ethan's eyes widened instantly. What? Charles remained calm. The position is yours if you want it. Ethan actually laughed this time, partly from disbelief. Sir, I'm a truck driver. You're more than that. I don't have a business degree. Neither did I when I started. I've never managed anything. Charles smiled slightly. You managed a 40-ton vehicle through a Montana blizzard while towing a stranded family behind you. He crossed his arms. Frankly, most executives I know couldn't manage a grocery cart. Despite himself, Ethan smiled faintly, but fear still twisted inside him. This is crazy, he admitted quietly. Drivers won't respect me sitting behind a desk. Charles shook his head. Then don't sit behind one. Ethan frowned. The best leaders understand the people working beneath them, because they were once those people themselves. Charles's expression softened slightly. You know what drivers need, because you've lived it. For the first time since arriving in Seattle, Ethan felt something unfamiliar rising beneath the fear. Hope. Dangerous hope. Charles stepped closer. I can teach management, he said. Budgets, operations, negotiations. Then he pointed toward Ethan's chest. But integrity? Character? Compassion under pressure? He shook his head slowly. Those things cannot be taught. Ethan looked down at the floor silently. His entire life suddenly stood at a crossroads. One road led back to endless highways, exhaustion, and surviving paycheck to paycheck. The other was terrifyingly unknown. Charles extended his hand. So, he asked calmly, what do you say? Ethan stared at the hand for several long seconds. Then, slowly, almost cautiously, he shook it. Charles smiled. Good. Then his expression turned serious again. Because Denver is a mess, he said, and we have a lot of work to do. The Denver Depot went silent when Ethan walked through the doors Monday morning. Not normal quiet. Tense quiet. Forklifts still moved across the loading floor. Diesel engines still rumbled outside. Radios still crackled from dispatch stations. But underneath all of it sat a heavy feeling of uncertainty hanging over the building like storm clouds. Everyone already knew. Victor Hayes was gone. And somehow Ethan Cole, the suspended truck driver Victor nearly fired, had returned as the new regional manager. The news had spread through Silver Peak faster than wildfire. Drivers stopped conversations when Ethan passed. Dispatchers stared openly from behind computer screens. Mechanics exchanged confused looks across the garage floor. Nobody understood what had happened in Seattle. And honestly, Ethan still barely understood it himself. He paused outside Victor's old office. The blinds were open now, the door unlocked. For years, drivers had dreaded being called inside that room. Ethan himself had stood there dozens of times, listening to threats, insults, and impossible demands. Now the office belonged to him. The thought felt wrong somehow. A young dispatcher named Kelly approached nervously, carrying a clipboard. "Morning, sir." Ethan almost winced. "Please don't call me sir." She blinked uncertainly. "What should we call you?" Ethan gave a tired smile. "Ethan works fine." Several nearby employees exchanged surprised looks. Small moment, big impact. Ethan climbed onto a loading platform near the center of the depot floor and looked around at the workers gathering below. Drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, warehouse crews. Most of them looked suspicious. Some looked hopeful. Others simply looked exhausted. Ethan understood all of those expressions because he had worn them himself. He took a slow breath. "Everybody listen up for a minute." The depot gradually quieted. Ethan glanced across the room. "For years this place has been run on fear," he began honestly. "I know that because I worked under it too." Nobody interrupted. "You all heard rumors about Seattle." He nodded slowly. "Most of them are probably true." A few nervous laughs spread quietly through the crowd. Ethan told them everything. The storm in Montana, the stranded family, the suspension, the meeting in Seattle, Charles Whitmore, Victor's firing. Complete silence followed when he finished. Finally, Ray, the mechanic, crossed his arms. "So what happens now?" Ethan looked around slowly at all of them. "Now we rebuild this place." The room remained cautious. People had heard promises before. Ethan understood that too. "No more impossible delivery schedules," he continued. "No more punishing drivers for weather delays. No more forcing exhausted people onto the road." Dispatchers looked at each other in shock. "And safety inspections are no longer optional shortcuts," Ethan added, while glancing toward the maintenance bays. "If a truck isn't safe, it doesn't move. I don't care who complains." Several mechanics nodded immediately. Then Ethan said the thing that truly changed the room. "Also effective immediately," he announced, "Silver Peak is adopting a new policy approved directly by corporate leadership." Now everyone listened carefully. Ethan looked toward the drivers standing near the loading docks. "It's called the Good Samaritan Rule." The depot stayed silent. "If any driver stops to help someone in danger on the road," Ethan continued, "and the delay is verified, they will not be punished." A few workers looked genuinely stunned. Ethan smiled slightly. "In fact," he said, "they'll receive a bonus." The entire room erupted into confused chatter. Ray actually laughed out loud. "You serious?" "Completely." A veteran driver near the back shook his head slowly in disbelief. Victor would have had a stroke hearing that. Several people laughed openly for the first time all morning. And just like that, some of the tension broke. Not all of it. Trust wasn't rebuilt in one speech. But something changed inside the depot that morning. Hope entered the building again. Over the next several weeks, Ethan worked harder than he ever had as a driver. He walked the loading floor daily, learned dispatch operations at night, sat with mechanics during repairs, rode along on difficult winter routes, and slowly, the culture inside Silver Peak, Denver began changing. Drivers stopped quitting. Accidents dropped. Morale improved. For the first time in years, people no longer feared walking into work. And every Friday afternoon, Ethan received a short phone call from Seattle. Charles Whitmore always asked the same question first. How are the people doing? Not profits, not deadlines. The people. 1 year later, the Denver Regional Depot had become the highest performing operation in the entire Silver Peak network. Nobody would have believed it possible, especially the people who remembered what the place used to be. The old tension was gone now. Drivers no longer walked through the building afraid of being screamed at for traffic delays or weather reports. Mechanics weren't pressured to rush dangerous repairs anymore. Dispatchers actually smiled during morning briefings instead of bracing for chaos. Even the building itself felt different, cleaner, brighter. alive. Ethan stood near the second-floor office window overlooking the busy depot yard as snow drifted softly outside across Denver. Below him, trucks rolled in and out of loading bays while crews moved confidently through organized shifts. The entire operation ran smoother than it ever had under Victor Hayes. Ironically, profits had increased too. Corporate reports showed lower accident rates, fewer driver resignations, improved delivery consistency, and the strongest safety scores in company history. Turns out, treating people like human beings worked better than fear. Who knew? Ethan smiled faintly at the thought. A knock sounded against the office door. "Come in." Laura stepped inside carrying 2 coffees. Ethan still wasn't fully used to seeing her here sometimes. A year ago, she had worried constantly every time he disappeared onto another 1,000-mile route through snowstorms and empty highways. Now he slept at home nearly every night. Mason actually had his father around again. That mattered more than any promotion ever could. Laura handed him a cup and looked around the office with quiet pride. "You still haven't decorated this place properly." Ethan laughed softly. "I'm still getting used to having an office." That part was true. Some mornings he still woke up, expecting to see highway lights through a truck windshield instead of sunlight coming through bedroom curtains. Laura noticed the framed photograph sitting on his desk. She always noticed it. The picture showed a dark SUV parked outside Pine Ridge Lodge during the Montana snowstorm. Ethan's 18-wheeler sat protectively beside it beneath falling snow, headlights glowing through the darkness. Charles Whitmore had sent the photo 3 weeks after Seattle, captured from motel security footage. Beneath the frame sat a small brass plaque. "Character is who you are when nobody is watching. Thank you for being a man of character." Laura touched the frame gently. That night changed everything. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah. A year ago, he had believed his life was ending while driving through that blizzard. Now he understood something different. Sometimes the worst moment of your life is only the beginning of something better. His office phone buzzed softly. Charles Whitmore. Ethan answered immediately. "Morning, Charles. How's my favorite depot manager?" Ethan looked down through the glass window at the organized movement below. "Busy," he answered with a smile, which usually means good. Charles chuckled quietly on the other end. "I just finished reviewing quarterly numbers." His voice warmed slightly. "Denver's leading every region in driver retention and safety again." Ethan shook his head. "Still feels strange hearing that." "Well," Charles replied, "when you build a company around decent people instead of fear, strange things happen." Ethan leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. Over the past year, Charles had become far more than a corporate chairman. Mentor, advisor, friend, maybe even the father figure Ethan lost years earlier. "By the way," Charles added casually, "there's another Good Samaritan bonus report on your desk." Ethan smiled immediately. Another driver stopped to help somebody? Family stranded outside Cheyenne during the storm last week. Charles paused proudly. Driver stayed 3 hours until emergency crews arrived. Ethan looked again at the plaque beneath the photograph. One decision, one snowy highway, one exhausted truck driver refusing to leave strangers behind. That single moment had spread further than he ever imagined. It changed a company. It changed hundreds of lives. And most of all, it changed him. Outside the office window, snow continued falling softly over the Denver depot, while trucks rolled steadily toward distant highways across America. Deliveries still mattered. Schedules still mattered. Business still mattered. But now, something else mattered too. People. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Cole finally felt certain he was exactly where he belonged.